Hi everybody. It's quite brutal not to be able to talk to you really normally, but there we go. Santiago, myself, Giulio are here to tell you something about daylight and the new methodology that we have developed to analyze cityscape and citywide daylight signature. There we go. So the motivation of this research is that, well, we come from the UK, where we work. We are not UK-ish, but what we do in our profession is to look after a lot of urban development and master planning. And there are some quite stringent rules and rule of thumb to look after how a new development should be and the way that should be integrated in the existing condition. But they are all based on quite old and then, well-established scientific ideas, but not really up to date with the latest technology. So we can probably do something new and something better. And also, I think we should look holistically to the district rather than just a single property or a single receptor. There are other ways to deal with that. So that's the motivation. The ambition is through our methodology to look after the cities and being able to develop them organically and then create a new good environment for the users, which is similar or comparable to something that exists. So the question is, how do we compare the existing to the new one? So the thing that happens most of the time in the standards is that you need to achieve a minimum threshold, which is typically the worst case scenario, a minimum. Now, in UK, we have a very good standard. It's a guidance document, actually, which is the BR 209. It's a document that tells you how to develop, how to build and construct massing so they don't impact on others and so that they are well for themselves. But it's based on very simple rules that are actually pencil and paper rules. So 25 degrees angle, 27% of vertical sky component, things that you can calculate with a diagram. And this is the type of diagram. You count the dots and you know the scoring of your development against the window. The new version of the guidance contains a very nice chapter, Appendix F, which tells you that you should be using custom targets, thresholds, for specific situations which are different from the generic one that are in the guidance document. But most of the designer and the consultant, they try to go for either a guess or simply ignore this part of the guidance and just say, okay, we just adhere to the standard values. And so that's the usual one. Because if there is enough light when everything is really dark, then there is enough light all the time, which is the worst case scenario logic. Now, the problem is that it's not about the worst case scenario, because with worst case scenario, you cannot really tell the people, I'm giving you quality, because you're just giving the minimum requirement, nothing more. So is compliance sufficient? Maybe not, if you want to convince people to invest and build something beautiful. And that's the question. Can we decode daylight and can we encode quality in the design? So now the scientific part will be explained by the scientist in the team.
Please. Okay. Hello. So we thought about using big data and a model that we had of the full model of different cities that we had, and to use statistical analysis to look at this. Yes. Okay. So first we looked at the different plans of different cities and how they differ from each other, how they are characteristic of each city, and you can probably recognize a few of these, and they are very different, and they also define a certain way of appropriating daylight. We look at the similarity with something like recognizing characters in a font and or handwriting, something that machine learning now can do very quickly and very easily. This is a training sets, and so we can use machine learning to group the different ways that buildings receive daylight into different kinds of facades to try to understand what's going on in a certain city. The data set. We started with a model of Birmingham.
Cardiff.
Cardiff, sorry. The first model was Cardiff, a smaller city. We tested what we could do with it. We defined calculation points every 5 meters for every facade on every street. And we calculated different values on each point, like vertical sky component, like annual sun hours or winter sun hours. Then we scaled up. We did the same for the model of London that we had. And these are some examples of values that we got. This is vertical sky component, for example. Now we can group all the points in the city and create a diagram like this, where in the horizontal axis we have vertical sky component and annual sunlight, and in the vertical axis is the winter sunlight. And this gives us already an idea of how many points have a good vertical sky component, how many points have low vertical sky component, and how the weather affects that in the sense that how many sunlight, how many annual sun hours there are. So we tested the same data set, the same city of London, but as if it were under different climates, and we can see the differences when the latitude changes and when the climate changes. So this seems to be useful. We can see that, okay, this is a bit small in this diagram, but the effect of orientation, the colors in the diagrams show orientation. And you can see that north orientations have low vertical sky components and low sun hours, and south orientation have the highest. And sometimes if they are blocked, they have low, but they go along the diagonals according to the orientation. Then the level of obstruction and the effect of weather. Sorry.
I think we can just say that they will get the paper with the PDF in the pack.
Okay.
So it's all there. You don't have to actually look at it.
I think it's interesting to note that from these graphics there is some things that can already be derived. But then what we did was to use unsupervised machine learning to classify these receptors into groups. In this case, there were 25. We tried with different numbers of groups, so that, for instance, this is orientation versus annual sun hours, and the dots are the center points of each group, which show the typical values for each group.
And the same
for winter sun hours.
Applies to all the other
yes.
things.
And vertical sky component, etc. So we then overlaid these points on the city. And these are now type of point. So this is, the color now represents which cluster they belong to. So similar, the points with the same color will have similar values of vertical sky component, orientation, annual sun hours, and winter sun hours. So they receive a similar amount and quality of daylight. This is a close-up. So we can see that same orientation with similar obstructions, levels of obstruction get grouped in the same clusters. But that is not enough, because we cannot extrapolate from each point individually to analyze what an area looks like. So what we did was to get areas, analyze by area. And so we did a random generation of areas, where, for example, some areas that we know, like Fitzrovia, Camden, etc. These are different areas of London that we know how they feel, how the daylight is behaving in those areas. And we analyzed the distribution of clusters, on the incidence of clusters, the type of clusters in those points. For example, we have sun hours on Fitzrovia because the streets are at 45 degrees towards the north. They get a very typical type of distribution, and in different parts of the city, some are more variated, some are have the streets all more parallel to each other. And the same for winter sunlight, vertical sky component. This shows that some different areas have different typical conditions. We added some other values like density and the sunlight level of sunlight on the ground. So for each area, we analyze how many points receive more than 6% of sunlight hours, or on the horizontal level as well, to account for open areas. And so for each area, we can create now a histogram where we say the number of points that are within each cluster, and also the number of points that receive a certain amount of sunlight on the horizontal plane, and also the level of density as an average, etc. And this creates like a signature for this area that shows how daylight is behaving in the urban space. These are all the histograms together for the whole London. And so we can now classify the histograms and say what are the typical areas that show the distribution, or the typical daylight distributions in the different areas of London. If we color code them, we add more colors. This is more or less what it looks like in London at the large scale, using a more refined grid. So we have some areas that have are more open to the sun, some areas that are less open, and so on. Some areas that have lots of variation, and some areas that are more uniform. And so that's how far we got. Conclusions you want to get? Sorry.
Okay, so well, the conclusion is basically that through the methodology of classifying first the receptor and then the areas by their histograms of typical receptor and typical values for sunlight and density, we can actually identify similarities in areas that are maybe different visually, but they are performing in the same way from a solar and daylight point of view. Now the next step obviously is to add the reflective dimension of the streetscape. So the idea is to scrap, maybe through Google Street View or something like that, the actual view of every street, and then classify even further. So we can then, in high density scenarios, provide a target that is the correct one. And there are 2 additional slides which are only for you if you go online and find the presentation, which propose a method for measuring the deterioration of improvement of a design over an area rather than a single point, or an alternative measure for the sunlight targets or thresholds, which is a bit more holistic than the one that is currently used in the UK. Thank you.